Thank you all so much for coming to Judy's dissertation defense entitled Network Movements Through the Dramaturgical Lens. And we're going to be hearing about a chunk of Judy's dissertation work today. There's more in the document for those who have read it or for those who would like to read it later. Before I turn over to Judy, a couple of notes about how this is going to run. First, I will say we have some accessibility accommodations today. Judy will be defending seated. If you cannot see her and would like to see her, now is a good time to pick up and move. We have coffee and snacks. And Judy's going to give her talk. This is a good time to get coffee and snacks. After that, I will ask you to wait until Judy has finished speaking. And when we start Q&A, you're welcome to re-snack yourself. Internet friends, you can hear us. However, we're going to ask you to stay quiet. If you have things to say, you can put them in chat. Oden Choi is managing our Zoom today. Thank you so much. After Judy's talk, we'll do questions from the committee. And after the committee has had a round to ask questions, you, the audience, will have a chance to ask questions. Thanks in advance for your thoughtful engagement with Judy's work. Anything I'm missing? Jodi, who's done this more times than I have? All right, okay. So without further ado, Judy, hit it.
Welcome. I am Judith Oden Choi, and this is my dissertation defense. Many thanks to Jess, who took over as chair and has helped me a lot through this last year, transitioning out of a medical leave into this last leg. And to Jodi Forlizzi, who has helped me this so many years, thick and thin. And to Sarah Fox, who's given me so many insights, and Deen Freelon, who's helped me very much with the Twitter analysis. And also to Jim Herbslove, who was instrumental in developing this work. The name of the dissertation is Network Movements Through the Dramaturgical Lens. A quick warning, there is some explicit language in the tweets, and there are some images of police corralling and using tear gas with protesters. In this dissertation, there are 5 studies. Through all of them, throughout my dissertation, I'm arguing for dramaturgy as a way to study networked movements. But today I'm going to focus on the last 2, in which I draw from the same set of data as ways to illustrate how I adapted the dramaturgical perspective for use in network movements in a polyvocal social media environment, and then the insights of applying that method and what that method reveals. Now let's talk about 2 theories and that are important, starting with the logic of connective action. So there we go. Just a second. So Bennett and Segerberg in about 2012, observing that online social movements operate very different than what had come before, which we call collective action, that were typically brokered by social movement organizations. They were centrally organized by an organization or membership that made decisions and then developed strategies that volunteers would then carry out, right? Noticing that what was happening with online social movements like Occupy and the Arab Spring was really quite different. They developed this theory of the logic of connective action. And a connective action is when individuals express their personal identity, their personal beliefs and convictions through what they call personalized action frames, through the use of hashtags or profile pics that they online, and that they are then only connected to others in the same sort of networked movement by those mechanisms of the platform, like the hashtag. And so in that way, the affordances of the social media seem to act as a kind of movement infrastructure in connective action. And So at that time, many journalists and also researchers who were marking this radical shift in movement organizing were giving a lot of credit to the technology itself, right? The Twitter revolution or the Facebook revolution. But this kind of organizing, regardless, was decentralized, composed of networks instead of memberships, and favored emergent processes over strategic ones. And so at the time, Bennett and Segerberg acknowledged that from collective action to connective action was a spectrum, and it probably wasn't 100% one or the other. The revolutions weren't happening simply because somebody was using a hashtag or a Facebook group, right? But spent a little time exploring what was really in the middle of that spectrum, what was happening there. So, but now, you know, a decade plus later, with the landscape of ICTs are much broader, and there's different functions that can reach different audiences and manage different audiences in different ways. Researchers, myself included, with the work in the first half of my dissertation, are really seeing that there's much more hybridity. There's much more happening sort of in the middle between this connected and collective action. And so what I was observing was that in this sort of more than connected action happening in these network movements is that even when activists were acting as individuals, they were not just expressing their personal beliefs, but they were acting in ways where they were trying to consider the needs of the movement when they were posting, and making calculated choices about which ICTs to use depending on, and how to use it depending on the roles that they were taking on, the task that was at hand, the perceived risk or safety of that task, and the audiences that they were trying to reach. And there was a lot of evidence of backstage coordination, even though it wasn't facilitated by a social movement organization or sort of a membership organization, and was facilitated by networks, often, you know, maybe a Discord channel or just friends on a group text, or odd, you know, there were all kinds of things came up, like a club, an unrelated, not even social justice, unrelated club, Snapchat group. You know, there's all kinds of ways that people were having backstage conversations about how that they should act and even act online in service of social justice movements. And so that led me to really think more about this sort of backstage, front stage question and the dramaturgical perspective. Usually when we talk about dramaturgy and HCI, we're talking about Erving Goffman's theory of impression management, which applies to individual behaviors. And in impression management, Goffman talks about how individuals might put on a mask and talk and act a certain way in one social context, and put on a different mask and talk and act a certain way in a different social context. And that when we're totally at home and can be ourselves, we take off that mask and we're totally authentic self, right? And this idea is kind of tied back to the Shakespeare, all the world's a stage idea. And in HCI, we use this often to explain social media choices or how one chooses to present themselves in different social media contexts. But since 1959, the presentation of self in everyday life, there was quite a bit of work on the social sciences and sociology and anthropology and performance studies that built on this idea of dramaturgy that Goffman proposed. In theater, dramaturgy and performance studies, dramaturgy was used to study kind of the structures of theater itself. This quote from Schechner, one of the founders of performance studies, is that theater is communitas infiltrated by structure. Communitas in this sense means a feeling of like everybody's in it together, a feeling of solidarity. It's an experience like when you might have as a religious experience, you might have at a concert or on the dance floor, or if you play sports. It's that temporary feeling like we're all in this together, right? And so theater is that experience, but it's a very structured and kind of controlled experience of that. And dramaturgy is the process of analyzing that structure and how that works to make it more transparent and to be able to use those structures and mechanics to create new dramas. And this kind of idea of analyzing the structures of experience is used in social movements to understand them as social dramas themselves. This partly comes in kind of the late mid-century out of a desire to understand Nazism and how the propaganda of Nazism worked, to think about the rallies and marches and events and the actual choreographies, the placement of flags, the soldiers in a row. What was it about the structure of those events and of those experiences that were so powerful on the psyche of those involved? So that same idea of analyzing the theatrical pieces of those events holds through to other kinds of social dramas like social movements. In social movements, so these quotes are useful to me in thinking of social movements as powerful dramas through which injustice must be dramatized and so must hope for civil repair. When there is a breach in trust, when things are broken, the hope is that it is repaired. And that social dramas are where protagonists and antagonists clash as they seek to affect audiences' interpretations of power relations. And just thinking of it as the sort of communicative power, how it's communicating the politics is interesting to me. So now into the first study on adapting the dramaturgical perspective for a networked environment, right? The first step is trying to think of Twitter itself as a stage. Now, there have been metaphors for Twitter. In the early days of Twitter, there were conversations about, is it more a broadcast media like a newspaper, or is it more a social network like a conversation? I'm asking us to think of Twitter like a stage. A stage is just a space for performance. And there are a few requirements for something to be a performance, besides that it's bound by space and time and interaction with an audience. And to think about the space of theater of a stage, I want us to not necessarily think about this sort of proscenium theater, but maybe think of a space like this, or even like this with the audience moving back and forth between performers, right? So thinking about Twitter as a stage, the space of the stage is perhaps the space of a social network, where the stage is the core of the network, where the performers are the most active, the actors are most active, and the periphery of the network is the audience participants who are the least active. And time, what bounds the performance in time is attention, right? As the attention wanes on the topic or the duration of the trending topic, right? Then the time of the performance also comes to an end. And whereas in a typical performance, usually the actors or the producers are the ones that control the time and space. In the thinking of Twitter as a stage, it's actually the audience, through the audience participation, that has the power to extend or end the performance in space and time. The audience interaction actually controls those factors. With input from the algorithm, right? Algorithm has a say in there. So now I'm going to move on to the data corpus itself. The data was collected via the Twitter search API from May 25th through October 1st, 2020. I added trending topics related to Black Lives Matter throughout the summer. Once the term was added, it remained on the list. I added everything that I found, whether it was Pittsburgh related or not. So it was quite a large data set to begin with. I then, at the end, I filtered it by Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh related terms like Danielle Brown or Justice for Antoine Rose, names and places and events that I knew would be related to Pittsburgh. This right here is the distribution by day of the tweets. As you can see, definitely far more tweets very close to the murder of George Floyd, and very few other peaks from there. I then went and identified three periods where there were some peaks in tweeting, and it also related to times when there were protests or actions on the ground here in Pittsburgh. So the first was May 25th through June 4th, which was the first initial round of protests after the murder of George Floyd. The second was around Juneteenth and the second anniversary of the murder of Antoine Rose by Officer Michael Roosevelt. And the third here was August 15th through 25th, which included the covert arrest of Matthew Cartier and the protests that followed at the home of former Mayor Peduto. These other peaks, this had to do with a tweet from Trump about Pittsburgh and the Steelers wearing Justice for Antoine Rose, except for Villanueva, and 4th of July and something else. Okay, the coding method, the kind of meat of this study. This was an iterative coding process, several iterations, of the top 100 most retweeted tweets in each of those three periods. The coding scheme I'm going to go into in more detail, but it involved what I called script types, objectives, and then whether those objectives were implicit or explicit, and included online or offline actions. The theory that I used for that was based on is based on the dramaturgical approach for social movements from Hunt and Benford. They used the metaphor of theater and broke it down into 4 elements of the theater: scripting, staging, performing, and interpreting, and compared those to those four elements in social movements. For them, scripting were scripts for how to act and what to say. Movement scripts guide participants, and each actor who performs the script interprets it through their performance and thereby transforms it through their performance of it. And that's also an aspect of scripting. The next is staging. And Benford and Hunt use staging as really like this catch-all phrase for everything that's happening behind the scenes. This is all kinds of preparation that goes into producing a protest or action. This is, marketing, budgeting, resource allocation, fundraising, scheduling, all of that work that kind of falls under staging. And performing. Performing is the collective action itself, performing the collective action, and also the experience of performing that collective action. The actor's job, what they hoped to do, is to persuade those in power to act according to those scripts or to elicit another specific desired response. And the last is interpreting. And interpreting stands on its own as its own kind of work. And it's also something that happens during all three other phases, all three other elements. In theater, the actor interprets their lines and their performance. The director interprets the script into movements for the stage. The designer has to interpret the script into functional and aesthetic design elements, sounds and stuff. All of those kinds of things happen in every bit. In this study, we're focusing on scripting because Twitter is primarily text-based and because we're looking at tweets that correspond with periods of on-the-ground protest and looking at whether they serve as guides for this kind of activist behavior, what's happening on Twitter. Scripts aren't like fixed text to be followed mechanically. They're just sort of guides and cues for behavior. And so that when something comes up, something unforeseen comes up, you have cues for how to behave. Unlike play scripts that are complete before play rehearsals begin, or traditional social movements where maybe leadership works backstage to develop a script before the protest, a Twitter scripting happens simultaneous to the performance. Each time an actor interprets a script expressed in a tweet and then performs it by tweeting, retweeting, liking, or even donating, etc., their action serves as a script for other actors on the platform. It's like a game of virtual telephone, with popular interpretations emerging as movement scripts writ large. So we looked at script types, and we looked at script types as scripts that guide the three other areas of elements of work. So staging scripts were scripts that guided coordination tasks, recruitment, like this flyer here, calls to action, and providing timely on-the-ground information, like, oh, there's a curfew change, or there's a SWAT team on this corner, etc. Performance scripts fall into two primary categories: extending offline protest online. This image here is an image of a protest. By providing this online, it allows me to have some experience of what's going on at the protest. It doesn't give us street name, at the protest downtown, right? And this could include effective reporting, meaning somebody giving their personal take, including a personal sort of emotional take on it. Or it can guide the online performance of protest. The online performance might include sort of slogans, hashtags, movement messages, or sort of trolling or attacking somebody in a position of power online. And generally speaking, they often serve to orchestrate emotion. Interpretive scripts make meaning of unfolding events, shape movement narratives, counter mainstream media. Objectives. This is another category, scripts and script types. The next category is objectives. We're talking about objectives, we're talking about a process of script analysis that actors often use. So if you heard somebody talk about objectives or what's my motivation, that's what we're talking about here, right? Behind us, we have a script with somebody's broken it up into beats, into sections with like their objective written: to scold, to drive home, right? An objective is a technique to help actors identify motivation for speaking and make decisions on how to behave in ways that serve those objectives. It's expressed in a form of an action, like to persuade, and it's intended to help actors make their performances more lively and the conflict more palpable. It's stated in terms of what action the actor will take, not in terms of what the author intends. Although in the tweets that we'll see, those often overlap. So here's some examples. I'm at a Black Lives Matter protest in Punxsutawney on Juneteenth with my 76-year-old pop. The world is changing. So as a script type, this would be a performance script. If I chose to follow this script to do something similar, I might take a similar type of photo of myself at a protest, or I would protest with family members. I might retweet this. The intent that the objective here is to inspire. She seems to feel inspired. If I choose to retweet it, I hope to inspire others. And this, on the other side, is somebody who's quite angry and is showing a video of cops mace and pepper spraying protesters. Right, and this one is to ignite. Maybe to ignite me to retweet this, maybe to ignite me to the point to take action, to show up at the next protest, to get involved in some way. Here is a tweet where the voice is a more neutral reporting voice, journalistic voice. Although the details that she shares seems to be sympathetic to Justice for Antoine Rose. The voice is neutral, and so this was categorized as to witness. To bear witness, if I retweet this, I'm asking others to bear witness to this event. Just a slither of the results that shared just a slither of the results here. Not surprisingly, the objective that was at the highest percentage of retweets was to ignite. Anger, we know, carries in tweets, in news media, in newspapers. If it bleeds, it leads. It goes back for several media in decades. To witness is fairly even between the number of tweets, the percentage of tweets and the percentage of retweets. But a staging tweet like to recruit has significant more tweets than the percentage of retweets. And this is a Venn diagram of the relationship between objectives and script types. The objectives further from the center have a higher association with the script type. Those closer to the center have associations with multiple script types. I believe a coding scheme like this is potentially transferable between movements and between media. I think there might be some peculiarities of our data set here, like to antagonize between staging and interpreting. I don't know if every data set has antagonistic staging in it. But I feel like, with some replication here, there's the potential to develop a coding scheme which is fairly stable and generalizable. And then for some discussion, I think one of the powers of looking at objectives is that they are actionable. So they have the power to, since they communicate actions, they have the power to transform an audience member into an activist if the audience member chooses to act on that objective, right? So if we move from the script, the objective, to the performance, a performance online the least action would be the mechanic of the feature of the platform to retweet, to like, right? That's kind of a given on any tweet. But the but the one objective that we had that actually moves, that the only way to fulfill it is to move offline, is to recruit, is that it moves straight from to recruit. How do you fulfill to recruit? Is that you move from to recruit to attend a protest. To attend a protest, you're moving into the area of activism. Something like to ignite, to inspire, you might choose to retweet that. You and from retweeting it, you might also be moved to attend a protest, but that's a question mark. Who knows? So we sort of looked at this as there's a realm of things from activist, from offline activist, online activism, more deep engagement with the online material, to an activist audience, somebody who's at the periphery, simply retweeting or doing the least involvement on the online, to simply an audience, somebody who reads and moves on. So just to recap, we adapted a dramaturgical approach for a polyvocal social media environment, use script analysis to understand action objective, looked at the transformative power from audience to activist, and the strength of the method, as I believe it's transferable between movements, platform agnostic, and media inclusive. Now that we've developed the coding method, I'll apply it to a more sophisticated network analysis of the same data set. In this study, I used social network analysis in tandem with the dramaturgical analysis to understand the social drama at the local level, identify primary actors, and gain insight into their scripting processes over time. I used the same data set, the same coding scheme. However, first used Levein community detection algorithm to find 10 largest groups in each period. I then inspected the 5 to 10 top profiles to describe the users in each of those groups. And then took a random sample of 10% of tweets from each of those groups, of quote tweets, replies, retweets, and original tweets, broken up that way because each of those have a different type of communication. So if we look at May, which I've labeled the breach, because this is when there's this huge break in trust with the murder of George Floyd, we'll see that there is 3 user types identified in the groups. One is local BLM in the red, and the blue is distributed BLM, which just means that those groups were not local to Pittsburgh, but they were discussing issues, still discussing things happening in Pittsburgh. And green is local news. The local news broke up by group by news organization, 3 being KDKA and 7 being Trib Live. Now, using the method of investigating the user profiles, I couldn't get any further more specific than to say that they were local BLM supporters. They didn't have sort of ethnicity in common, or age in common, or affinity group in common. But when I did sort of the dramaturgical analysis of these groups, we could dig a little further and see a pattern here. In group 4, which this tweet is a representative of what was happening in group 4, was composed primarily of performing tweets, like this one, that were to witness a lot of images of what was happening on the ground. In group 5 was composed primarily of interpreting tweets. This one is about a police car that was vandalized during the first night of protests. Group 4 and group 5 had 949 links between them, the most of any two groups in the sociogram. And group 8, the second most connected, group 5 and group 8 had 247 links between them, was primarily staging scripts like this one, meant to prepare or to protect the protesters with a warning of where the cops are marching down center to downtown. So even though they weren't different by user identity, they were very different by the script type and by what the objective, what they were trying to accomplish. So one contribution of this method is being able to distinguish differences in groups of users that appear the same in network analysis. In June, around that Juneteenth holiday, the focus of the protests were not explicitly on the murder of George Floyd. They turned instead to have a focus on the second anniversary of the death of Antoine Rose, and that coinciding with the second anniversary of Juneteenth. Important to notice off the bat here is that there is one anti-movement group here, the only exclusive anti-movement group found in the whole data set. And that is because around this time, the young man who vandalized the police car in the earlier protest was arrested, and that group is discussing that. In June, we can see the sort of work being done to contextualize the justice for Antoine Rose with Juneteenth and with the larger Black Lives Matter movement happening across the summer, with the objective to remember popping up throughout the data set. Here is a performing script with to remember, again, with images of actions happening across the images happening over the day. And here is an interpreting script where we see Senator Bob Casey doing the work of both connecting Juneteenth to the movement for Black Lives and the movement for Black Lives to the local instantiation of it with the movement for the justice for Antoine Rose. And that interpretive work is, work in and of itself. So seeing that shift in framing from the national event to the very local, to the local movement is something else that became quite clear through the dramaturgical analysis. Another thing that's clear in the June data is that there's a shift in the way the staging scripts look. The staging scripts in May were to protect, were like timely information. Here's where the police are, here's the change in curfew. We need to let protesters know this right now. In June, instead, it was recruitment. It was recruitment flyers, newspaper listings of events, right? And these sort of artifacts of these flyers suggest that there's planning involved, right? There's the ability to pre-plan these events. And that brings us to a separate question altogether, which is the actual scripting process, right? In May, there was some improvisation happening, some improvised responses, whereas in June, we have some evidence of some prepared responses, some preparation. And an analogy to theater, to scripting processes, you might say June has a more typical playwriting scripting process, where in May was a more improvisation. The thing to keep in mind about improvisation is that it's not actually flying by the seat of your pants. The improvisation actually works by having a really deep knowledge of story structure, and by working together as an ensemble to really know culture, to have bits prepared, to know each other's cues and to have deep awareness, is how improvisation works. When somebody from another troupe with just as much experience comes and tries to improvise with you, it can be hugely disruptive. And I just wonder if some of that might be happening with the Black Lives Matter and Justice for Antoine Rose movement activist in May, and somebody with anarchist scripts coming in and improvising with different scripts and disrupting some of what was going on in the early May protests. So identifying scripting processes is another contribution here. August, things get really interesting because now we have no local news, and we have these split groups. Public official is the general term I was using, but really public official here is our former Mayor Peduto. Mayor Peduto clashing with BLM activists and BLM and other supporters of Peduto sort of clashing within the group. There's sort of fighting and arguing and replies happening. So they're within group. Means local, so at least within these three groups in yellow here. The other thing that's interesting is that there is 9 of the 10 groups are performing. And the one other group is interpreting. That suggests to me that Twitter itself has become a second site of protest, right? The performance of protest has actually come to Twitter, as well as the actions that are happening on the ground. The other thing that it tells me is that there are no staging scripts here at all. There's no recruitment for the protests that are happening at Peduto's house. And there's no warnings happening here. Where have those things gone, right? So we're understanding what's missing, what elements of a movement are missing. And taking a quick look at one of these, group number 1, one of these groups that are where we have this clash. The incredibly short story here is that this A Beautiful Night in the Neighborhood is a tweet from Mayor Peduto sitting on his front steps, evoking Mr. Rogers, a Pittsburgh icon, on a night after a covert arrest of which means kidnapping in an unmarked van by the Pittsburgh police of a protester off the street. After this covert arrest, while BLM organizers are gathering, had gathered asking to speak to him at his yard, at his home. And this is his response. This is actually labeled as to antagonize. Later that night, protesters were corralled into a nearby park. There was use of tear gas and munitions. By the next day, there was this parody video posted using the intro to Mr. Rogers, intercut with images, with video of the police using tear gas for those protesters. This to me tells me that there was this video. At the end of this video, there's credits that tell me that there were journalists that offered video footage for this video. There was an editor. This account is primarily a Pittsburgh sports account with 42,000 something followers. So there was coordination among several people to create this response video, this parody. So this kind of coordination is happening with people using their particular skills and ability and the particular assets that they have. And yet none of that is happening on Twitter. None of that staging is happening. So that staging must be happening via some other kinds of ICT and coordination. And it suggests that as the summer progressed, the activists were probably developing more sophisticated communication protocols. And if I were to compare that to a theatrical scripting process, it would be devising, which is a collaborative scripting process. The cool thing about devising is that you're not just collaborating with other playwrights or with other actors, but you're collaborating with other area expertise, people with area expertise, other stakeholders, designers. You might develop a script that not only includes dialogue, but also has choreography or has music or has research involved into it, has folded into it. So it's a way of combining many kinds of expertise. And I think that is something that is kind of cool and kind of becomes evident when you see people contributing in ways like the video. And what this looks like to me, if I'm giving a name to what's happening in the middle here, is that I would call this cooperative action. What I'm seeing in this August time period here. And cooperative action, the aspects of cooperative action are, while it's outside of the scope of this talk to go through all of the attributes in the other papers that I have in the dissertation, many of these attributes, if not all of these attributes, are pieces that are found in the other papers that we have worked on. The cooperative action includes roles that are undefined, but based on an individual or subgroup's assessment of movement needs and the individual's ability to fill those needs. It includes hybrid framing processes, this kind of hybridity that we've mentioned here. Staging is only for select audiences, not something that's on public social media. It requires relationship building and trust between individuals and subgroups. It includes a communication ecosystem, use of many ICTs, like we saw in 90 for 90, if y'all were part of that, and developing communication protocols. So a contribution of dramaturgical method is making something like, is cooperative action. And being able to name cooperative action. In my future work, besides validating the coding scheme of scripts and objectives, and continuing to do the theory building around cooperative action, is that I hope to be able to design for cooperative action. This collaboration is difficult. It's difficult work. And using the dramaturgical lens in the design of cooperative action, I think that means looking at social media as a kind of design material itself. And if we think of social networks as stages and tweeting as these simultaneous acts of scripting and performing, then we can use dramaturgical analysis to understand the structures of those performances and design structured experiences, perhaps collective actions, perhaps liminal experiences of communitas, by understanding the mechanics of social media platforms and using them as materials in our devising. I hope that these contributions are useful to researchers who study activism, that these methods are useful to them, and that the specifics of these Black Lives Matter case studies are useful. I also hope that it's useful to the stakeholders, to activists themselves, that this language is used to formalize what they're already doing and help them make design decisions in the future. And to people who are designing for networked movements. Just real quick, we're going to look at one area that I touch on in the work, and it comes up often, of transparency versus surveillance, and how using dramaturgical lens and looking at this as a cooperative action might go. I might look at what some of the by surveillance, I just looked at this. By surveillance tactics, I meant tactics to avoid surveillance. Yeah, so for transparency tactics, you need awareness within your network and across politically aligned networks, especially to communicate staging scripts, like to protect and to prepare, and to recruit safely in new networks, and to tactics to avoid surveillance, mask identity of activists, manage audiences, limit audience engagements, and create security scripts, right? And so the way that I might address this would be to start with some research, right? I would research and do a dramaturgical analysis of movements where there's been we were just laughing about mispronouncing this. COINTELPRO. Where there has been CIA surveillance, and how recruitment was dealt with in the face of this. It's, if useful, dramatize, enact, or make schematics, to make theatrical structures more transparent in the way that that was dealt with, and then draw on those structures for new designs, adapting into the medium that we're using. As an example of an approach. So in conclusion, we developed a novel dramaturgical method for analyzing network activism, provided analysis of BLM tweets related to protest in Pittsburgh during summer of 2020, introduced cooperative action, and discussed future work in designing for cooperative action using dramaturgical approaches. To thank my family, Mom, Dad, Ann, Josh, Art, Ben, Luke, Mom, Dad, Robert, Joel, Rocio, Anna, my creative and business partner, Peter, my love and support through all these years, Chiwan. Thank you. And to all my committee members and my collaborators and colleagues and friends and everyone who's been so supportive, thank you so much.